this is Mr. Tybox123, and in this video I'm going to be bringing you a comparison showdown between the 11-inch MacBook Air and the iPad 2. A lot of people say, which one should I buy, which one is better, which one do you prefer, etc, etc. So hopefully this is going to answer some of those questions. Now, I've got my own personal preference on this, and when we come to the end of the video I'll explain what mine is and I'll talk you through exactly why I feel that way. But what I'm going to do is I'll come up with a bunch of different areas where we can compare these two, and I'm going to give them a point each if they win on each different area that I've come up with, or 1 point each for a draw. So the sections that I've come up with in terms of the comparison are the price, the screen, the performance, the battery life, the operating system, connectivity, design, the input method, the cameras, and also the flexibility. So let's start off with the price. The 64GB MacBook Air comes in at around £850, and if we compare that to the 64GB iPad 2, that's around the £700 mark. So a small difference there, but if we were to go out and buy a keyboard for the iPad 2, then we're getting to the point where they are of a very similar price point. Now, what do you get for your money? Now, obviously the iPad 2 is a very portable device, and so is the MacBook Air. The MacBook Air is probably more flexible because there's more things you can do with it, and also has a larger real estate screen. But then there's a whole load more apps for the iPad 2. So really, I think in terms of price, they probably come out about the same. So I'm going to give them 1 point each in terms of the actual price. Now let's come on to the screen. The MacBook Air has a screen with a resolution of 1366 by 768, and the iPad 2 has one of 1024 by 768. So the MacBook Air has a slightly larger real estate than the iPad 2, and if we look at the pixel density as well, on the MacBook Air it's got 1.05 million pixels, whereas the iPad 2 has got 768,000 pixels. So again, the MacBook Air kind of wins out there. Now, in terms of the quality of the screen, the iPad 2 has a screen which uses IPS technology, and the MacBook Air has a screen which uses TN technology. Now, IPS technology is supposedly better and is supposed to give you a much nicer viewing experience, but my personal preference in terms of the two is that the MacBook Air has a nicer screen and a more highly defined screen. I find that the writing on the iPad 2, when it gets down to quite a small size, can be quite difficult to read and has fuzzy edges, whereas on the MacBook Air the writing is much more defined, right down to a much smaller font size, and is much more clear. So higher real estate, more pixel density, in my opinion a better viewing experience. So on terms of the screen, I'm going to give this one to the MacBook Air. Now on to performance. It's kind of difficult to compare the two of these in terms of performance, but let's look at the actual technical specifications of the two. Now, the base model MacBook Air has a 1.4 GHz Core 2 Duo processor, and the iPad 2 has an A5 1 GHz dual core processor. So the MacBook Air is slightly better on that one, and is probably a more powerful processor in general anyway. In terms of memory, we've got 512 megs on the iPad 2 in comparison to the base 2 GB of RAM on the MacBook Air. If we look at the storage, well, in fact, if you went for the 64GB version of both, then the storage is pretty much exactly the same on the two. Now, how do these specifications actually break down into real life performance? Well, let's just do a couple of basic things that you would do in everyday life on both of these and see how they both perform. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just launch Safari at exactly the same time if I can, and then we'll see which one loads fastest. So you can see on the MacBook Air, Safari literally launched in an instant, and on the iPad took slightly longer. Now both of these were already running as a background process, so it's an equal test here between the two. Now if we go to a web page on both of them, what I'll do is I'll launch up the same website on both and click go at the same time, and then we'll see which one loads the page fastest. Now this isn't really a very good test because they're both sharing the same Wi-Fi connection, so one may get priority over the other, but we'll give it a go anyway and see what happens. So straight away there you can see that the MacBook Air loaded up the page a lot quicker than the iPad 2. Now let's go into something else so we can compare the speed. Now the equivalent on the two is system preferences against settings, so let's hit them at the same time. And that one was about equal. Maybe the iPad 2 was very slightly quicker. Even in terms of startup times, if we just turn both of these off, to turn on the MacBook Air, all I do is just open it, instant on. To go on the iPad 2, I go on, swipe it, and it's on. When I use the smart cover, I can just open it and it's on. So in terms of the startup times, they're pretty much exactly the same from a standby point of view. However, if we turn both of these devices off, the MacBook Air is shut down already. Let's just wait for the iPad 2 to shut down, and there we go. Now I'm going to turn these on and we'll see which one of these boots into their operating system the fastest. And this is from a completely off position, not in the standby mode. So the MacBook Air is up and running, booted and ready to rock and roll, and the iPad's probably not even halfway through booting yet. So again, the MacBook Air I find it a lot faster in every way to use than the iPad 2. So I think in terms of performance, the actual real life performance of the two is fairly similar, but with the fact that the MacBook Air has got larger and higher and better specifications than the iPad 2, I think in terms of performance we can give the edge to the MacBook Air. So I'm going to give another point there to the MacBook Air on round 3, which was performance. Now the next level is battery life. Now the battery life on the MacBook Air is supposed to be around the 5-hour mark, and the battery life on the iPad is supposed to be around the 10-hour mark. Now real life scenarios with these, I usually get about 7 to 8 hours out of the iPad, and I usually get about 4 to 5 hours out of the MacBook Air. So on battery life, most definitely the iPad 2 wins out on this round, as it lasts a lot longer than the MacBook Air. So we give a point there to the iPad 2. So just coming into round 5 here, and the MacBook Air has got 3 points, and the iPad 2 has got 2 points. So 3-2 in favour of the MacBook Air at this stage. So the next one, operating system. Now it's quite difficult to compare these two operating systems between each other because they kind of work in two completely different ways and really give you two completely different user experiences from one another. But let's take a look at the operating systems themselves. Now iOS, which is on the iPad 2, is a very, very basic operating system. It's literally click, launch, close, done, and that's pretty much all you can do with it. With the operating system on the MacBook Air, this is running Snow Leopard, and it's a much more flexible, much more advanced operating system than iOS. And in my opinion, I would rather have the Mac OS X operating system than the iOS operating system if I had to pick between the two and use it on a day-by-day basis. The Snow Leopard operating system is obviously much more powerful, much more sophisticated, and you can do a lot more with it than you can on iOS. But then iOS is obviously very simple and very, very easy and quick to use. So it's kind of a draw, but I definitely think that the sophistication and the advanced operating system that Mac OS X has definitely got to give it the edge over iOS. So I'm going to give this one to the MacBook Air as well. So the score at the moment is 4-2, and the next round is connectivity. Now they've both got wireless in, they've both got Bluetooth, and they both connect to the internet and various other devices wirelessly in very much the same way. Neither of them have an Ethernet port, so kind of equal on that whole front, but the MacBook Air does have a collection of USB ports. Now, although it doesn't have many, we have got one on this side and also one on the other side, whereas the iPad 2 has only got the 30-pin connector. And with that 30-pin connector, although you can connect an external display or a camera to a certain degree, the iPad 2 really doesn't have the flexibility of having the USB ports. I can literally connect any USB device to my MacBook Air and that's going to connect up and work. So a lot more flexibility and range of devices that you can actually connect to the MacBook Air over and above the iPad 2. So again, I'm going to have to give this round to the MacBook Air. Now, on to the design. Both of these devices are extremely beautiful devices. They've got an amazing design to them. The MacBook Air is just a stunning laptop to look at. It's completely revolutionary. There's nothing else like this whatsoever, and it's just a fantastic looking laptop. The iPad 2, again, absolutely fantastic design. Nothing else can come that close to it in terms of the overall package, but I don't think it's quite as revolutionary as the MacBook Air, because there are quite a lot of tablets out there that are of a similar look and size and shape to the iPad 2. But being that they're both revolutionary designs in their own right, they both look absolutely incredibly beautiful, I'm going to give this one to both of them and call it a draw. So coming into the 8th round here, the MacBook Air is 6-3 up on the iPad 2, and the 8th round is going to be the input method. Now on the iPad you're really kind of restricted to the input method. You've just got your simple touch and swipe system there. You've got the ability to do pinch and zoom, and you've also got the ability to bring up the on-screen keyboard and type into that. On the MacBook Air, we've got the trackpad here, which supports full multi-gestures. So you get the ability to navigate pages back and forwards, scroll up and down, pinch and zoom, rotate, all the other things that come with multi-touch gestures. You also get a full-size keyboard that is much easier and nicer to use than the on-screen keyboard on the iPad 2. So I think I'm going to have to give this round again to the MacBook Air, because it has got all of the gestures that the iPad 2 has got, but you've also got the added bonus of the fact that you've got a full-size keyboard to use instead of having an on-screen keyboard. So have to give this one again to the MacBook Air. Now onto the cameras. Well, the MacBook Air I think has a 0.3 megapixel camera on the front for doing FaceTime calls and Skype, and the iPad 2 has got a VGA camera on the front for doing the same thing. Now the iPad 2 has got a second camera on the back which is capable of 720p recording. So in the pure fact that it's got two cameras and one of them is capable of high definition recording, I think we're going to have to give this round to the iPad 2. However, I must say that the camera on the front of the MacBook Air I find is a lot better than the camera on the front of the iPad 2. But the fact that it's got two cameras, the fact you can record in 720p, got to give this round to the iPad 2. So, 10th and final round here is flexibility. Now, I find that the flexibility between the two devices has got a vast difference. The MacBook Air is much more flexible than the iPad 2. You can't even customise the look and feel of the iPad 2. You can't do a whole range of different things that you can do with the MacBook Air. The only way it's a little bit more flexible than the MacBook Air is in the fact that it's got a lot more different apps that are available to it in the App Store than the Mac App Store. But there's a whole bunch of applications that are out there outside of the Mac App Store for the MacBook Air. There's probably not as many games as there are for the iPad 2, but the general flexibility of the device is just vastly superior to the iPad 2. The fact that you can install Windows on it as well adds another little level there, and just overall it's a much more flexible machine. If I had to do my day-to-day business, I literally could not do it on an iPad 2, but I can do it on a MacBook Air. So in terms of flexibility, I've definitely got to give it away here to the MacBook Air. The sheer fact that this one on the MacBook Air runs OS 10 and this runs iOS, which is a lot less flexible than OS 10, I've got to give this round to the MacBook Air. So let's just tally up those results there. The way I have it is that it's 7-4 in favour of the MacBook Air. And as far as my opinion on the products goes, that kind of tells the story as to exactly how I see it. If I had to choose between the two, I would most definitely choose the MacBook Air all day long. If I go on the internet, I would much rather get out my MacBook Air than use the iPad 2. I find it a much nicer experience. It's much faster, it's much quicker to type on, much quicker to navigate your way around. Plus you can be doing other things at the same time. The iPad, it's got a nice experience. It's unique in terms of the way it looks and feels, and it was very revolutionary when the iPad 1 came out, and it's a kind of nice to have. But I could live life without the iPad 2. Whereas to do my job and to do my daily work, I probably couldn't live life without the MacBook Air. So for me, there's only really one winner at the beginning of this and also at the end, and the points kind of show that as well. The MacBook Air is a much better device, much more flexible. The fact that you've got a real operating system on there that is flexible and configurable over and above one that is it's a much more flexible machine. You've got a lot more capability with it, and overall I prefer the screen, I prefer the definition of the screen, and just the overall experience of using the MacBook Air I prefer a lot more over and above the iPad or even the iPad 2. Whenever I want to do anything, I just find it much more convenient to pull out the MacBook Air and just go on the internet on that rather than going on the iPad 2. Plus it's got the added flexibility of the operating system and the keyboard and the trackpad. So for me, there really was only one winner for this, and if I were you and I had the amount of money that both of these require, I would pick the MacBook Air all day long. So I hope some of you found that useful. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.